Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. We don't usually delve deep into politics unless it's germane to our subject, but tonight we will cover two of the cartoonists who were killed in Paris at the satiric magazine Charlie Hebdo when two Islamist gunmen killed 12 people on an attack at the magazine several weeks ago. The two cartoonists are Cabu and Georges Wolinski, and our coverage on them is from the BBC4 show Last Word with Matthew Bannister.
Millions joined in France's day of mourning for the 12 people killed when gunmen stormed the offices of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo in Paris. Among the dead were two of France's best-known cartoonists, Jean Cabu and Georges Wolinski. Both men were household names who for decades had been at the forefront of the country's thriving satirical scene. Their work was published not only in magazines but also in the national press, and they regularly appeared on TV and radio. Wolinski had served as editor-in-chief of Charlie Hebdo for 9 years in the 1960s, and Cabu was a shareholder in the magazine. On the line from Paris, I asked the journalist and commentator Agnès Poirier for a sense of how important the two men were in French cultural life.
Cabu and Wolinski were part of the family. People were crying in the streets because they had just lost the eccentric uncle or eccentric grandfather. They were born in the 30s. They had started their career very early on. So it means that having contributed to so many different magazines and also being regular guests on radio and television, they have shaped the political humor of generations of French people.
Let's talk first then more about Jean Cabu. Here he is describing how he started out as a cartoonist.
My dad was a professor of practical arts. He told me when I was 15, if one could earn a living by drawing, everyone would do it. But I understand what he was saying, because at the beginning you don't earn very much. When I was 10, I won a competition which was published in a magazine called Curvaceous, a magazine for poor people. From that moment, I was copying other artists like Dubout. By 15, I was drawing for a newspaper that still exists called L'Union de Rime. I would go once a month to city council meetings where I would make caricatures, and I was lucky because this is where I learnt my trade.
So Agnès Poirier, when did Jean Cabu first start to make an impact on the French public?
Well, quite early on, actually. He was the average Frenchman in the sense that he was conscripted into the French army during the war with Algeria, the Franco-Algerian War, came out of it quite distressed and very anti-army, a bit like Wolinski, I must say, and he developed different characters. I mean, we all know them. One is called the Grand Duduche, and that's a sort of eternal adolescent who is quite naive and very gentle, a bit like him in life. He's always amazed by great things, but also in the cartoon puts the finger at the hypocrisy of the world or the horror of the world. There was another one going on, and it's going to be such a shock not to see it on Wednesday in the Canard Enchaîné, which is the other great French satirical weekly. It was called Mon Beauf, which is my brother-in-law, the sort of archetypal French provincial man, a bit sexist, a bit racist, and he just made millions of people laugh every week.
I believe that Jean Cabu was a co-founder of a satirical magazine called Harakiri, which was banned by President Charles de Gaulle.
Well, here you are. When you put the finger with your cartoons on the hypocrisy of the time, whether it's with de Gaulle or with the Islamists today or with the Catholics or, whoever, I mean, the thing is, they took aim at everyone.
Well, let's say more about Jean Cabu's colleague, Georges Wolinski. He was born in Tunis into a Jewish family and moved to France in 1945 to study architecture, but he soon dropped out to become a cartoonist.
A cartoonist is someone who reflects on the time he lives in, who criticises or evaluates the changes that take place. The times have changed a lot since I started at my first satirical magazine. Then I was just a boy in the Alps. I think the French have changed a lot since then.
Agnès Poirier, what was Georges Wolinski's route to fame?
Well, Wolinski, in a way, is extremely different to Jean Cabu in the sense that he started with erotic cartoons, and sex or erotism was very much part of his kind of humor. He was making a lot of sexist cartoons, for instance, being a man of his generation probably, but it had become his signature. And
were there those who criticised him for that?
Well, of course, the feminists did. It doesn't matter to be offended. We should be offended. And so that was his kind of humour, not as light and elegant as Cabu, but rather more, it was all about ribaldry in the French way, but also political.
What about the drawing style of the different men? Did they draw in very different ways?
They did. If you look at Cabu's drawings, there's something extremely elegant and very light about them. And, the characters always seemed to be flying, to be in the air. Wolinski was less elegant, more in your face, more erotic. He was different that way.
Both men must have known that they were taking risks with their lives, I suppose. How did they react to that risk in public?
We are in France, we're in Paris. I don't think they ever thought one minute that, they could die, although they did receive, of course, during all their career, flack and criticism, but from everyone.
But they must have known that drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad was a particularly provocative action.
They knew it, except they also knew that they had no choice. You can't make exceptions. Either you laugh at life or you don't, but then you can't decide just to put a group outside because you think, oh, they will take it so badly that they are going to put a bullet in my head. You can't start living like this.
It's difficult singling out two people from such a terrible event, but I wonder if there has been a particular sense of shock and loss about these two well-known cartoonists.
Oh, the shock is immense. People are extremely moved. People are bursting into tears, since Wednesday. And when people go and march this weekend, and you can expect millions in the streets of France, you'll see people in tears because they've lost not only a great artist. You can say that Jean Cabu was the Matisse of cartoons. They were not just polemicists. They were great artists, and the French loved their artists. But they were part of the family.
Agnès Poirier on Jean Cabu, who's died aged 76, and Georges Wolinski, who's died aged 80.
We're going to move on now to our feature tonight, Anita Ekberg, who died recently at the age of 83. A couple weeks back, we did Vernal Lisi, and I said that in the 50s and early 60s, Hollywood was looking for the answer to Marilyn Monroe in Europe, the curvaceous blonde. Vernal Lisi was from Italy, while Anita Ekberg was the curvaceous blonde answer to Marilyn Monroe from Sweden. She won the Miss Sweden contest in the early 50s and came to the United States for the Miss Universe contest. She didn't win it, but she did get a Hollywood contract. And through the 50s, she was primarily in some schlock movies, including Abbott and Costello Go to Mars. She was in some junk with Victor Mature and with Dean Martin. She was in a pretty decent movie with Lauren Bacall and John Wayne, Blood Alley. But the point about Anita Ekberg was you couldn't ignore her because of her figure. She pretty much had the ideal 1950s measurements, 40, 22, 36. She had a great body, blonde, come-hither look, the whole 9 yards in the late 50s. She was developing into a major star in the United States, and here she is as the mystery guest on What's My Line, and you can tell by the audience reaction, by John Daly's reaction, that even in 1958, she was a pretty big star.
Now, panel, as you know, in the case of our mystery celebrity, we go to a different form of questioning. You ask one question at a time in turn, moving clockwise. And let's begin with Arlene Francis.
Are you in the entertainment world?
Yeah.
Mr. Sir?
Are you a great big, beautifully built blonde?
Dennis, you'll have your answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Miss Kilgallen?
Were you born someplace other than the United States? Yeah.
Well, let's see. Is the country in Europe?
No, the Far East.
No, I think we'd have to give you a yes on the general geographic designation, Miss Francis.
Is it the northern part of the country?
Yep.
If we said, hey, Anita, would you turn your head?
Yes, I would turn my head.
You want to say it all together?
Anita
Yes,
Ekberg.
that's right. Mrs. Steele, I'm afraid that audience gave away a very great deal when you came in and signed in.
Well, I think the panel is much too smart.
Well, the panel is.
Those whistles.
That is an ovation of enthusiasm, the like of which we have not seen around these parts for some time.
John Daly referred to her there as Mrs. Steele because she was married to one of her co-stars, Anthony Steele, at the time. Anyway, Anita Ekberg was big in the United States, but she became a major international star in 1960 when the director Federico Fellini paired her up with Marcello Mastroianni in La Dolce Vita. It's a classic Italian film, and she was in one of the classic movie scenes of all time, where she wanders in Trevi Fountain and calls for Marcello Mastroianni to join her.
Marcello, come here. Hurry up.
As I said, that's a legendary scene, and Anita Ekberg will be immortalized forever for that scene. The story today is that Federico Fellini made Anita Ekberg with La Dolce Vita and that Trevi Fountain scene, but Anita Ekberg always maintained it was the opposite. And you just listen to that What's My Line clip, which was 2 years before La Dolce Vita. I think she probably was right. It was she that made Federico Fellini and not the other way around. Another interesting sidelight from that, we did Rod Taylor a couple of weeks back, and Anita Ekberg was reported to have had a few boyfriends in her time, including Frank Sinatra, Yul Brynner, Tyrone Power, and lo and behold, a young Rod Taylor. When Rod Taylor starred in The Birds in 1963 opposite Tippi Hedren, the character he plays mentions that he read in the newspaper that the character that Tippi Hedren played jumped in a fountain in Rome without her clothes on. Well, Anita Ekberg did have her clothes on in La Dolce Vita, although barely, but you had to believe that Hitchcock was making an allusion there to Anita Ekberg in her legendary role. La Dolce Vita was the height of her career, went downhill after that, and she often said that her great beauty and great figure were a huge advantage early in life, but became a huge disadvantage later in life. And I think we've seen that as a recurring theme happen before. A couple of years ago, Playboy magazine came out with a list of the 100 sexiest actresses from the 20th century, and Anita Ekberg wound up at number 14. She gave an interview where she discussed each one, and here she discusses number 14, Anita Ekberg.
Anita, what I wanted to ask you about was this Playboy list. Sexiest women of the century or something.
That's what they said.
Number 14, Anita Ekberg.
Oh, that one I don't know. Never heard of her. I don't know why she's on the list.
Were you flattered?
No, to me it's such a nonsense. It doesn't make me hot or cold. I'm only glad that I'm before Lower Bridge now. I should have been before Sophia Loren too, as far as that is concerned. That's the only thing.
Sounds like a little rivalry with the Italian actresses Gina Lollobrigida and Sophia Loren. Yeah, when they asked her about Sophia Loren, who was number 6, she said, "Who's that?" By the way, in case you're wondering, Marilyn Monroe was number 1. And Anita Ekberg gave her her due, but conceded that maybe she was number 1 because she died so young. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepp. So we're going to close tonight with a brief mention of Darrell Winfield, who died at the age of 85. Darrell Winfield was one of the Marlboro Men. In the late 60s and 70s, Marlboro used real cowboys to promote their product. It was this individuality, masculinity, freedom thing. That whole campaign was dreamed up, I think, by Leo Burnett and Philip Morris. And Darrell Winfield was the real thing. He was a real cowboy. He used his own gear a lot, and they promoted him in billboards. Marlboro had about 5 or 10 guys that they used as a Marlboro Man through the years, but Darrell Winfield was probably the most frequently seen in the 1970s. Newspapers like to point out that a lot of those guys died young of cigarette smoking, but Darrell Winfield, hey, the guy made it to 85. The whole concept of the Marlboro Man died in 1998 with that big tobacco settlement where they banned the use of humans in tobacco advertising. But back in the 50s, long before they had Darrell Winfield, Marlboro had an even better pitch man, or pitch person as it were, because they had Julie London. And anytime I get a chance to play some Julie London, I'm going to do it. So we're going to close with one of the great tobacco commercials of all time, with Julie London singing the Marlboro theme. You hear this and you see her on TV and you might take up smoking back in the day.
Julie London sings the Marlboro song.
You get a lot to like with a Marlboro filter, flavor, pack or box.